hard to imagine the fury of Lake Superior when the weather changes in an instant and a peaceful day turns into a nightmare. On May 10, 1953, the nearly 13,000-ton Wilfred Sykes, one of the largest bulk carriers on the lakes, was in the middle of a routine voyage. The weather was unseasonably warm, with temperatures in the mid-70s. Lake Superior was as smooth as a pond. Weather forecast warned that a minor squall, with winds reaching 30 miles per hour, would pass over the lakes that day. But this caused little concern. Almost every ship on the lakes at the time could handle that, and much worse. As the day went on, the weather indeed took a turn. The wind whipped at Lake Superior, building swells that crashed into the Sykes with surprising force. As night fell, it was clear that the weather forecast woefully underestimated the strength of the storm. But the Sykes was large, nearly brand new, and well designed. She was perfectly capable of riding out the storm. On her bridge the next morning, still fighting the storm, First Mate David Kinnear manned his post alongside Captain George Fisher. Suddenly, a call for help crackled over her radio. The desperate plea came from Captain Albert Stiglin of the Henry Steinbrenner. Kinnear never forgot the words he heard on the radio that day. "We're all awash. I think I'm going to founder. All our hatch covers are gone. It looks like we're done for." Bad luck seemed to follow the Henry Steinbrenner from the very start. Designated hull number 14, she was built by the Jenks Shipbuilding Company in Port Huron, Michigan for the Kinsman Transit Company of Cleveland, Ohio. The Steinbrenner was a typical ore carrier built just after the turn of the century. Workers were forced to launch her hull ahead of schedule on September 28, 1901 to protect the brand new ship from a fire that broke out near her slipway. Some might see this as a bad omen of what was to come. Named after the head of the Kinsman Transit Company, the Henry Steinbrenner measured 427 feet or 130 meters in length, with a beam of 50 feet or 15 meters. She came in at 4,719 tons and could carry approximately 6,500 tons of bulk cargo, typically iron ore. Her design followed the blueprint of almost all lake freighters from the time. Her forecastle contained cabins for her deck crew, a pilot house, and the captain's cabin. The rest of the crew was housed in her stern, along with her galley and mess rooms. These crew spaces bookended her cargo holds, which were covered by a long flat deck and accessed through 12 telescoping hatch covers. She was powered by Scotch Marine boilers that fed steam to a triple expansion steam engine, generating a service speed of 12 knots. She was operated by a crew of 30. It only took a few years for the Henry Steinbrenner's bad luck to catch up with her. On December 5, 1909, while transiting the St. Mary's River, she collided with the Harry A. Berwind near Round Island on Mud Lake. The steamer's bow smashed into the Steinbrenner amidship, tearing open a 25-foot hole. Water flooded in and she quickly sank, settling into the mud until only her aft deckhouse and pilot house emerged from the water. With her spar deck approximately 5 feet below the surface, the freighter was initially considered a total loss. But after further examination, it was determined that the ship could be saved after all. Salvager Tom Reed was paid $35,000 to refloat the ship. His team waited until the shipping season ended to begin their work. They had to cut a hole through the 12 inches of ice that covered Mud Lake before sending divers to patch the hole in the ship. When the ice finally thawed, they built a coffer dam to raise the deck above the surface so they could pump water out of the ship and finally refloat her. Despite considerable effort, the salvage was successful, and the Henry Steinbrenner was soon returned to service. She suffered another, less serious collision in 1923, when she collided with the John McCarthy in heavy fog on Whitefish Bay. It cost $15,000 to repair both ships. Then, in October 1941, she rammed a lock wall in the Sioux, causing significant damage. But once again, this was repaired and she was returned to the lakes. By 1953, the Henry Steinbrenner had been sailing for over half a century. She was the oldest vessel in the Kinsman fleet, but she was far from the oldest freighter on the lakes. On May 4, 1953, she was recertified by the American Bureau of Shipping. Earlier that year, in February, she was dry docked for her 5-year survey and easily passed inspection. Despite the official confidence, some on board questioned her seaworthiness. It was clear that the Steinbrenner was showing her age. Non-essential equipment was often broken, and she was not always a comfortable ship to work on. Some alleged that the Mulholland-type clamps that secured her hatch covers were so old that some of their threads had been stripped away, leaving them persistently loose. But lax maintenance and aging ships were common on the Great Lakes. Few could have foreseen any serious issues when the Henry Steinbrenner began the 1953 season. A season that would be her last. In 1953, Captain Albert Stiglin was new to the Henry Steinbrenner. From Vermilion, Ohio, Stiglin spent 16 of his 27-year career with the Kinsman Line. Before he took command of the Steinbrenner, he captained the Philip Mensch for 4 years. The 46-year-old captain was respected by his crew and widely considered to be a skilled navigator. May 10, 1953 was a beautiful day. The sky was clear and temperatures reached the mid-70s. As the Henry Steinbrenner, loaded with 6,800 tons of iron ore, left the Northern Railway dock in Superior, Wisconsin just after 5 a.m., Lake Superior was perfectly flat. Captain Stiglin recalled that it was smoother than a pond. It should have been a routine voyage down the lakes to the Bethlehem steel mills and Lake Erie. As the sun crested the horizon and the Steinbrenner began her downbound run, all seemed well. Her steering and navigation equipment was checked and working properly. On this trip, her radar was broken, but on a clear day like this, it wasn't needed. Her 12 hatches had been closed and secured, each fastened by 28 clamps. The heavy tarpaulins remained stored away. Securing the tarps was a long and tedious process. While they were essential in heavy weather to ensure that the hatches were watertight, they were only secured when captains expected the worst of conditions. While the weather that morning was ideal, the forecast called for a change later in the day, with 30 to 35 mile-per-hour winds and occasional thundersqualls. Mild storms like what was forecasted would not have been any cause for concern. Anyone with a season or two of experience on the lakes would have experienced far worse gales. Captains prided themselves on riding through heavy weather, and while freighters were simple, they were thought to be tough and capable. A few mild late spring squalls were nothing to be concerned about. The Steinbrenner's tarps were left stored away, and Captain Stiglin sailed down Lake Superior, completely unaware of what lay ahead. For a few hours, the Henry Steinbrenner enjoyed great weather as she made her way down Lake Superior toward the Sioux locks. But at 3 p.m., that all began to change. Stiff south to southeast winds swept over the lake, and the flat calm was broken by building waves. At 4:30, the first water broke over the Steinbrenner's weather deck. As conditions rapidly deteriorated, Captain Stiglin realized that they were in for something far more challenging than the forecasts that morning had predicted. Before it was too late, he sent a crew out on deck attached to a lifeline to re-inspect and secure the 12 hatches. With wind and surf whipping at their backs, a small crew moved from hatch to hatch, making sure that each clamp was tight. The storm grew worse, but things looked secure. A cold dinner was served in the galley at 5 p.m. It was too rough for the galley crew to prepare anything else. Most of the deck crew who were housed in the bow weren't even able to make it to the stern for the meal. The Steinbrenner was a typical example of the older freighters with no interior tunnel connecting one end of the ship to the other. The only way to traverse the ship was to cross over the open deck. By early evening, this was all but impossible. By 8 p.m., wind and waves routinely smashed over the ship. As Captain Stiglin fought to keep the Steinbrenner on course, a deck watch rushed over to him with alarming news. The number 11 hatch cover had come loose. Flapping in the wind, it lifted with every wave, letting a torrent of water pour deep into the cargo holds. Something had to be done before too much water entered the ship. Third mate George Wiseman and 3 other deckhands secured themselves to a lifeline and carefully climbed down the length of the ship to the 11th hatch on the opposite end of the ship. Wind and massive waves knocked them off their feet time and time again. As they worked to secure the number 11 hatch, a huge wave crashed over them, sending one man plunging 15 feet into the open cargo hold. Fortunately, the other men were able to lift him back on deck, and they carried him into the galley. Despite the fall, he was unhurt. Leaving him to recover, the rest of the crew ventured back out and finally secured the hatch cover. By the time they finished, the waves crashing over the ship were so large and violent that it was impossible for them to return to the bow. They would spend the rest of the night sheltering in the aft quarters, knowing well that every wave brought more water rushing over the vulnerable hatches. By the time they realized the ferocity of the coming storm, it was far too late to secure the tarps. They knew that without these covers, every wave sent water pouring into the cargo holds. As long as the hatch covers held, the ship's pumps should be able to keep ahead of the flooding. But if another hatch broke open, water would pour into the ship, almost certainly spelling their doom. By 11 p.m., they faced the full force of the storm as they battled 80-mile-per-hour winds and waves that reached as high as 30 to 35 feet. Captain Stiglin fought to keep his ship sailing into the wind, keeping the brunt force of the waves focused on his bow. But as conditions worsened, waves seemed to crash over the ship's deck on both sides as they swirled past the imperiled freighter. Down below, her engineering crew worked diligently to maintain steam, giving the captain the power he needed to fight the storm. The ship rolled violently. At one point, oiler Al Augsburger claimed that the ship rolled so heavily that a massive wave sent water pouring down her funnel. As midnight passed, the Steinbrenner kept fighting. Her speed was reduced to just 4.8 miles per hour to keep her steady, and her crew waited anxiously for any break in the storm. But the wind screamed on, ripping away at the aging ship as she creaked and moaned with every crashing wave. It was the longest night anyone on board could remember. And with each hour, things only seemed to get worse. At 4:30 that morning, things took a turn for the worse. The number 11 hatch, which had held out for so many hours, once again broke loose. By this point, the conditions battering the Steinbrenner were too violent to send any man out on deck to recover the hatch. Captain Stiglin had no other option but to hope that the pumps could keep up with the flooding. But with every roll, the open hatch dipped below the waves, allowing water to pour deep into the ship. By 6 a.m., the deck crew realized that the ship seemed to be losing power, and her rudder was slow to respond. Worse yet, other hatch covers seemed to be coming loose. In a last-ditch effort, Captain Stiglin tried to turn his ship around so that the aft deckhouse could provide enough cover so that men could venture out and recover the open hatches. But the maneuver failed to provide any relief. No sooner had they recovered from the failed maneuver, a wave crashed into her pilot house, ripping open a wooden door. The crew tried to brace the broken passageway, but with every wave, it broke open once again. The Henry Steinbrenner was being ripped apart. Captain Stiglin realized that their situation was only getting worse. At 7 a.m., he sent out his first call for help and ordered his men to don their life jackets. He still held out hope that he could save his ship, but now his attention turned to saving his crew. 6 vessels responded to the call for help, including 2 of the largest ships on the lakes at the time, the Wilfred Sykes and the Joseph H. Thompson. All now raced to the foundering Steinbrenner. But could Captain Stiglin keep her above water long enough to meet the rescuers? The water was only around 35 degrees. If his men went into the lake, they would only have a short window of time before hypothermia set in. But only about half an hour after sending out his first call for help, hatches 10, 11, and 12 all broke completely open. Water was now freely rushing into the ship. Captain Stiglin knew that it was time. He ordered the ship stopped and sounded a general alarm. About 15 miles south of Isle Royal Light, he sent out a desperate mayday call. At 7:36, he ordered an abandoned ship, letting out 7 short blasts from the ship's whistle, followed by 1 long one. The next few minutes would be life or death. The Henry Steinbrenner's final plunge happened quickly. With her 3 aft cargo holds open to the lake, she sank stern first. Captain Stiglin and the 9 other men stationed in the bow gathered around the life raft secured near her pilot house. The captain watched as the ship's 2 lifeboats, housed over the aft superstructure, cleared the ship. Her starboard boat was launched properly, with a group of men on board. Her port boat floated clear as the stern plunged beneath the waves. Feeling confident that his men had made it off the ship, Captain Stiglin joined the 9 other men on the small raft just as the bow made its final plunge. As the water rushed over the deck and the raft lifted free, a large wave swept over them, flipping the small raft. 6 men, including the captain, climbed back on board, but 4 disappeared in the rolling sea. The 6 by 12-foot raft, made of 2 wood frames on either side of a few metal air tanks, was rated to hold 15 men. But now, in the chaos of disaster, it was hard to believe that the small raft was capable of saving anyone. It offered no protection, and the 6 men who clung to the raft were battered by constant wind and waves. At the stern, the crew went to work launching the 2 boats, the moment they heard the call to abandon ship. 7 men were able to get away in the starboard lifeboat, but the port boat jammed in its davits. As the stern plunged beneath the waves, someone unshackled the boat from the falls, and it lifted free in the water. When they ripped away from the ship, at least 1 man was thrown violently into the sea, leaving just 1 man on the boat. As the ship began to sink, 19-year-old Kenneth Cum rushed on deck. He saw Isle Royal in the distance and thought that he might be able to swim to shore. But before he could jump, a fellow crewman stopped him. The man said that the water was far too cold to make it. Then, in a strange twist of luck, a massive wave washed over him. It swept Kenneth from the deck and washed him down the middle of the ship. He remembered seeing the ship's open cargo holds as the water pulled him aft. He felt a jolt of heat rush past him as the ship's boilers exploded in the frigid water. When he finally made it to the surface, gasping for air, he found himself only a few feet away from the port lifeboat. Kenneth joined 21-year-old second cook Bernard Oborowski and Frank Tomczak as the Steinbrenner disappeared beneath the waves. Their boat was almost completely flooded, and they had nothing to help them bail the water out. Even if they could, wave after wave washed over them, flooding the boat. Soon, they didn't even have the strength to try. Kenneth was a big man, weighing around 225 pounds. He was sure that his size was the only thing that kept him alive. At one point, Frank lost consciousness and washed overboard, but Kenneth and Bernard were able to pull him back into the boat. The life raft and the two boats slowly drifted away from each other as the survivors waited desperately, hoping that someone heard their calls for help. The survivors of the Henry Steinbrenner drifted for over 4 hours before help arrived. 6 ships responded to Captain Stiglin's SOS and raced to the area south of Isle Royale where the Steinbrenner went down. Conditions were rough, with low visibility that made it difficult to find the small boats in the heavy swells. As the Wilfred Sykes approached the scene of the accident, Captain George Fisher scanned the horizon, looking for any signs of life. Finally, he caught a glimpse of the half-flooded port lifeboat as it pitched high on the crest of a wave. He pulled his massive freighter alongside the small boat and a Jacob's ladder was dropped down. Kenneth Gum was the first to grab a hold. He was only barely able to lift himself out of the boat, and the crew of the Sykes then lifted the ladder and the frozen man on board. Just as Kenneth was pulled on deck, a large wave separated the lifeboat from the ship. Captain Fisher had to pull the ship around in a full tight circle to rejoin the 2 men left in the lifeboat. The maneuver took over an hour. To bring the boat in, the Sykes' third mate, Arthur Ritter, and a crew of 9 volunteers lowered one of the Sykes' lifeboats. The difficult operation was successful, and the crew went to work trying to warm up the freezing sailors. But for Frank Tomczak, their efforts were too late. He passed away shortly after he was brought on board. But Joseph H. Thompson found and picked up the men balancing on the Steinbrenner's raft, including Captain Stiglin. And soon, Captain A.M. Everett of the D.M. Clemson spotted the starboard lifeboat. After a failed pass and some tricky maneuvering and a near miss that almost sent the lifeboat into their propeller, he positioned his freighter to provide a lee, and the 7 men were brought on board. They were taken to the captain's cabin, where they were given warm baths, hot food, and dry clothing. For both the lifeboats and the raft, rescue came just in time. Another half hour or more in the open water, and more men surely would have been lost. In total, 17 men went down with the Henry Steinbrenner. As the survivors were brought to shore, attention shifted to finding out what caused the accident. The Coast Guard went to work interviewing the survivors. Several crew members criticized the state of the 52-year-old ship, claiming that she was not seaworthy. The strict clamps on her cargo hatches were pointed out to investigators, and there was some added scrutiny to her past collisions and accidents. The Marine Board of Investigation wrapped up their inquiry on May 18th, only a week after the accident. They concluded that despite her age and the concern of some of her crew, the Steinbrenner was adequately seaworthy when she went down. This was bolstered by inspections that were carried out on the ship not long before the accident, and testimony from other crew members, including Kenneth Gum, who claimed that her clamps were in fine condition and her hatch covers were adequately tight when secured. Ultimately, the board found that the sinking was caused by the failure of her number 10, 11, and 12 hatch covers, which came loose in heavy seas and caused critical flooding that the ship couldn't survive. Ultimately, the accident was blamed on the adverse weather conditions and was deemed an act of God. They did not fault Captain Stiglin for neglecting to secure the tarps before departure, deeming that any reasonable captain would have made the same decision given the conditions at the time. But the Commandant of the Coast Guard at the time strongly disagreed with the board's conclusions. He pointed out that Captain Stiglin's decision not to secure the tarps was not an act of God and went against regulations that stated that exposed cargo hatches had to be properly secured before leaving protected waters. Captain Stiglin was ultimately stripped of his master's license for failing to take this step, but no other disciplinary actions were taken, and the tragedy soon faded from memory, with few lessons learned. Over a decade later, one of the survivors, Norm Bragg, found himself on another aging freighter caught in a brutal storm on Lake Huron. the 603-foot Daniel J. Morrell. As the ship began to go down, Bragg gave advice to his fellow crew members on how to survive. Before going down with the Morrell, his final words were, "It's been good to know you." Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, support the channel with a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd like to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and my channel members. Their support helps keep the channel afloat. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Till next one, be nice to people.